everyone. This is the Buttercup Podcast where we talk about early childhood topics. Today, and my name is Marisa Macy, and I'm the host of the Buttercup Podcast. And today I'm so excited because I have Dr. Scott McConnell here.
Hi, Marisa.
Hi, Dr. McConnell. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Scott McConnell has been a teacher, program director, researcher, and college professor interested in preschool and early elementary education for more than 40 years. Dr. McConnell is a professor emeritus of educational psychology at the University of Minnesota and director of assessment innovation at Renaissance Learning. Prior to joining Renaissance, Dr. McConnell was part of a multi-university team that developed individual growth and development indicators. Some of you know it as IGDs, and I'm super excited to talk to you about IGDs. And he's conducted research on their use in preschool classrooms. His professional interests focus on young children's paths to becoming proficient readers and the ways that systematic interventions like multi-tiered systems of support can help all children achieve that goal. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology at Portland State University and his master's degree in school psychology and Ph.D. in educational psychology at the University of Oregon.
Go Ducks.
We're both fellow Ducks. We both went to the University of Oregon. Different times. I never got to meet you all.
Yeah.
I was there.
My loss.
My loss too. But you came back for a visit, and I think that was even before I had gotten there. Dr. McConnell lives in Minnesota, and he and his wife, Laurie Davis, are parents of 4 adult children. Welcome, Dr. McConnell.
Why, thank you so much.
How did you get started in early childhood education?
You know, you said that I graduated from Portland State University, but that was the end of a pretty long journey. I like to say that I attended most of the colleges on the West Coast, and Portland State was just the last one for my bachelor's program. Somewhere along the way, I think my sophomore year, I was a student at Sonoma State College in California and was enrolled in what was then called an early childhood program. It was the old days of early childhood. So it was primarily focused on kids without disabilities. It was primarily focused on 3-year-olds to first or second graders, where there was this sort of combination of instructional approaches and program options to consider. And California was going through a licensure revision. And so that program, which was relatively small, closed for a year. So I had to not go to school for a year. But I think that was where I first sort of set my sights on early childhood. When I went to graduate school, as you mentioned, I focused primarily on school psychology and special education. So those were probably a little bit older kids, kindergarten, first, second grade kids. But my first job after graduate school was at the University of Pittsburgh in a program that had a lot of early childhood special education faculty and projects. And that was where I really sort of immersed myself in preschool education, first for kids with behavior disorders and other risk factors. And then it's just sort of led from there towards kids in special education, kids who were at risk for developmental achievement problems because of other conditions, and just early childhood. And it turns out that preschool kids are really fun, aren't they? So it was an easy transition. Early in my school psychology training, I did an internship in a middle school. Gosh, if you compare middle school kids to preschool kids, preschoolers win by a lot in my world. So I think it was sort of a set of opportunities. I think I came into the profession around the time that early childhood was growing. So it was sort of, I wouldn't say coincidental, but it was just, I followed opportunities, I think is a way to put it.
Followed opportunities. That's awesome. And you were at the University of Pittsburgh when so many amazing people were there. Dr. Mark Wollery was there. Dr. Stefano Bagnato was there and still is there.
Sam Odom, Diane Sonata, Linda Cordiscos, Phil Strain, Mary Margaret Kerr. It was really, and in the department broadly, it was the Department of Psychiatry, all sorts of really sort of well-regarded and frankly kind of nice researchers. It was a really great place for a young professional.
Yes, and Pittsburgh, there are so many exciting things happening in early childhood in Pittsburgh. Fred Rogers Institute is not too far from there. So many exciting things. So It's so interesting when I get to talk to people like you, Dr. McConnell, and others who it's so fun to hear your path, your journey, uh, and different experiences that have gotten you to where you are today. And so, one of the things that you did when you were at the University of Oregon is you created a scale, an assessment tool with Dr. Hill Walker, the Walker McConnell scale. And is that where you kind of got your start with this passion for assessment and developing assessment tools?
Yeah, it's a great question. You mentioned, and I was trained as a school psychologist. Hill Walker was my mentor and advisor in graduate school, and one of the world's greatest people, as I bet you know too. Um,
Yes,
he
absolutely. Go
he
Hill Walker,
go
Dr.
Hill Walker. He taught me a bunch of things that I think are related here. One was the importance of doing things that matter for teachers and kids. So I am particularly proud of the fact that across my academic career, almost all of the research that I've done has been done in classrooms and kids' homes, not in labs, not with gizmos stuck on kids' heads, but really kind of how children spend their time, how they spend their time with teachers and other children, how they spend their time with their parents and families, and how that relates to their development. So I think what I learned from Hill is that interventions need to matter, and that interventions matter best when we know who gets the who should get the intervention, what that intervention should be, and whether it's working or not. And so that drove me towards assessment. I don't think of myself as an assessment person. I think of myself as an interventionist. But to be an interventionist, I need guidance about who and what and how it's going. And so that really has, in a very major way, I think, driven me towards really probably the bulk of my interest and work is in assessment right now. So I think it's bent me because I wanted to make sure that we could help kids that need help.
Yes, thank you. And can you tell the story about IGDs?
Sure. Yeah, it's very similar to what I was just talking about. So after the University of Pittsburgh, I moved to the University of Minnesota in 1986. And I've been so fortunate, Marissa. So we talked about Oregon and Hill and Ziggy Engelman, Wes Becker, Rob Horner, Diane Bricker, whom we both know, amazing faculty members. Then I went to Pittsburgh and we talked about who my colleagues and friends were there. And then I came to Minnesota and went into a department that had school psychology, special education, counseling, and a foundation statistics program. What amazed me about going there was that it was like the people that I read in graduate school, they were now my colleagues. They were like down the hall. And so exactly in the same way that I was just talking about becoming an assessment person to make sure that interventions are being provided to the kids that need them, there was this guy, Stan Dino. He was down the hall. So Stan is now deceased, but another remarkable person, humble, kind, smarter than the day is long, and really, really focused on doing things that help kids and help teachers help kids. So the origin story, so Stan, as you all might know, was the original developer of curriculum-based measurement and really fostered the research that became what CBM is. So Lynn and Doug Fuchs and Mark Shin and Doug Marston and zillions of other people have carried on what Stan started. The origin story that Stan had for curriculum-based measurement is that he was doing, at least my version of it, he was doing a program in an elementary school in Minneapolis for struggling readers. And so he would get together with these kids and do these kind of good interventions for these children in their classrooms. But he couldn't figure out if the interventions were working or not. He couldn't figure out if he was doing what the children needed. So he wanted to have some easy to collect, repeatable, because he was really interested in sort of timelines, time series data, like curriculum, like applied behavior analysis. Could he get easy to collect, repeatable, and highly reliable information that told how the kids were doing in reading? So he tried a bunch of things. He worked with a colleague of his named Phyllis Merkin. They tried this, they tried that, and they discovered you could just take a chunk of text that was in the child's reader and ask them to read it for a minute and count how many words they got in a minute. And that was a wonderful estimate of their overall reading skills, their decoding, their comprehension, their fluency, their vocabulary, all of that embedded in this 1 minute, how many words can a child read correctly measure. So Stan did this. When I got to Minnesota, that research had been going on for over 10 years. It was very productive. And Stan always had this graph that he showed that was a kindergartner who started at zero. I should do it this way. This way. Started at zero and kind of went up really slowly and then started climbing as the child started to learn how to read. And so I would say to him, Stan, well, zero, the kid can't do nothing. The kid doing something, and they're doing something more as you continue to have zero. What's going on there? He said, not my problem. You figure it out. So, so along with some really great colleagues and students, we started down the path of trying to figure out easy to collect, repeatable over time, gives vivid information about intervention, is related to long-term outcomes. Could we do that? We tried some really goofy stuff. We finally found a few things that seemed to work for the kids. And that was where individual growth and development indicators came from. We had a couple of really fortunate opportunities for funding, first through what was, I think, called GIPRA, the Government Performance Review and Accountability Act, where every state or federal agency needed to come up with outcome measures for their assessments. And the Office of Special Education Programs funded us at Minnesota, folks at the University of Kansas and the University of Oregon to develop what they called program performance measures for infants and toddlers, preschoolers, and elementary school age children. That work produced IGDs for individual growth and development indicators for preschoolers, what Judy Carta and Charlie Greenwood came to call infant IGDs for babies and toddlers, and DIBBLs, which are curriculum-based measures for elementary school age kids that Roland Good and Ruth Kaminsky developed at the University of Oregon. And so that sort of launched us. And then there were a couple of other opportunities, the Early Reading First Act and some technology grants, and then the Center for Response to Intervention in Early Childhood that really gave us the chance to mature the measures and get them to the point where teachers could use them with some confidence.
Wow, that is so exciting.
It was fun.
Yeah. And so that's such a neat origin story. And over time, what have you noticed about IGDs and curriculum-based measures that you've gained a deeper understanding today?
Such a good question. One is, remember I said we wanted them to be simple and easy to collect, and the early preschool versions, there were 3 of them. They took about 1.5 minutes per child. So 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes once you pick a child up from their activity, bring them over, do the assessment, send them back to whatever they were doing. We were so proud of ourselves for making them brief. And I was talking to my son's childcare provider and I said, hey, Bobby, look what we're doing. This is really cool. And she stopped and looked around her classroom and she had 23 kids. And she said, Scott, 23 times 5.5 or 6 is a lot of time. So easy is still easier is still something that we aspire to. I think the other thing, another thing that I learned is that building a simple measure, a measure that produces easy to interpret results, and helping teachers interpret those results in an accessible and speedy way that they find interesting and compelling, that's hard. That we need to figure out how to support teachers in doing the important work that they do, both in terms of making it timely, feasible, doesn't take too long, but also in making it sort of apparent, vivid, so that they can see the information that they want to get pretty quickly. Then I think the third one is that it's been a little more challenging than I originally predicted or expected to build an assessment that's useful in many, many, many different circumstances. So we talk all the time, and for instance, in assessment work about validity. So validity, one of the pieces of evidence for validity is that you collect a measure, you do an intervention, you collect the measure again, and it changed, right? The measure changed. It showed that the intervention had some effect. Well, that presumes that there is an intervention that's working and that it's working in a way that the assessment detects. Those two things are variables, right? That we don't oftentimes control. So how we support the variation, variety, diversity of sort of outcome expectations and goals that preschool programs hold has been, I think, probably the hardest thing for us to do, so that we can say with confidence, you should do this and feel like it's going to be a good use of a good application for their needs.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So IGDs is a curriculum-based measure, and if educators are using curriculum-based measures in their programs, uh, what did you see happen during the pandemic when the whole world changed and
Yeah.
uh, people had to come up with alternatives to face-to-face assessments? Do you want to share anything that you noticed during the pandemic with curriculum
Yeah.
designers assessing kids?
I think the first thing is that so what I saw was our home offices, right? So that's
Yes, welcome to our new world.
yeah. I, go back to what I was saying about my work with Hill Walker, that 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 assessments should serve intervention services, right? That we don't assess kids just to assess them. We assess them to figure out how we're doing and to figure out if we need to do something differently. And I think looking back on it, one of the biggest questions I would have about education, and particularly childhood education during the pandemic, is, in retrospect, what was our commitment to fostering development for kids versus making sure people were safe? That's a good outcome. Making sure that families had some level of support, making sure that there was some ongoing sort of connection to their program. I remember, I bet all of us do, that in February of 2020, we thought it was going to last a couple, 3 weeks. And so, having teachers that reach out to parents and say, hey, we really miss you, come back in a couple, 3 weeks, that made a lot of sense. A year later, a year and a half later, our situations had changed, or actually not changed. But I don't know that we ever really wrapped our heads fully around how to support kids' development during that time. So as a result, I think the need for assessment was somewhat different and perhaps even lessened. We did, however, there were some programs that continued to operate. There were some programs that wanted to think about, even through virtual services, or remember, a lot of people converted to sort of home-based services. Teachers would show up and sit in the driveway with the children and do stuff. We pivoted towards remote administration. So using Zoom, something like this, where we came up with some adaptations. That I should mention that IGDs are administered by a teacher, an examiner, an adult, and a child. So one-on-one administration. And there's in the best example of it, there's devices that each of the people are looking at. So the child's seeing pictures on an iPad, and the examiner is seeing that picture and some instructions about what to ask the child. So it was pretty easy to adapt to this kind of format. So we did that. I think that was probably a good thing to do. It was probably important, giving people access to a resource that they might find useful. I don't know that it was particularly earth-shattering. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm so interested to wait another decade or so that we can look back on those 2.5 years, and hopefully that those 2.5 years are behind us now. Look back on them and figure out what went well and what we could do differently, and how to think about that as we think about being sort of maximally respectful and in service of kids and families. And I'm not sure I have the perspective yet to do that.
Yes, it's still so yeah, not enough time has passed to really gain a deep understanding of what the heck just happened back there.
Yeah. But enough to hope that it doesn't happen again. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, are there any assessment innovations that excite you today?
Yeah, tons. Gosh, there are so many. Some really easy ones. Speech recognition, right? That's cool. Lena, Soapbox, other assessments where kids just go through their lives and we learn how much they're talking and who's talking to them and what's being talked about and how many conversational turns there were, so that now we can assess language interactions and language development when we're not there. That's cool. Speech recognition within, I guess the second innovation would be sort of child-directed activities that provide assessment information too. So I love to use the example of like walking into an Apple store, probably a Microsoft store too. I just don't go in those. But walking in an Apple store and seeing the little kids over in the corner with the iPads, they apparently know what to do and they're really, really good at it. Can we leverage their interests, their skills in a way that gives them something that's developmentally enriching and that provides us with a little bit of information about how they're doing? Cognizant of screen time access and sort of the downsides of that, but thinking about how to use that technology wisely, I think. And then maybe speech recognition within those gamified assessments. And then I think the third one that I'm particularly excited about is sort of taking that LENA language assessment in natural environments and stretching it so we know even more. I just learned about a really, really cool, to me, a really cool assessment program that's being developed by Wildflower Montessori, a foundation that's expanding Montessori programming throughout the United States. And they've developed this way, they call it observant education, to use cameras and sensors in the classroom to figure out what Marissa was doing, what Scott was doing, who Scott was talking to, what materials Marissa was using, and then to put all of that together in a way that a teacher can better understand how all of the children spent the time in their classroom, and then how to use that in a Montessori way to guide the kids in future interactions and future activities in the classroom. So it's this wild combination of like hardware technology and artificial intelligence, but again, with this really, really strong focus on utility, on making sure that we're doing things that don't take a lot of time and that give teachers and families really good information about their children.
Yes, that is great. And Dr. McConnell, my students listen to this podcast, and I'll be using this one in an assessment class that I'm developing that's going to start this fall for the first time. It's a brand new assessment class. And what you were saying about technology and how it has changed assessment practices is so on point, because with language, my students may not know this, but back many years ago, if you wanted
like 10,
yes, like maybe 10 years ago, if you wanted to get a language sample, you would maybe go into the classroom and you'd have your clipboard and you would be writing everything down that you heard the child say, and it's very noisy, and so you might not get all the words that you heard, or anyway, it was very messy work, very hard work, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of professional resources to be in the classroom, if that's where you're doing it in vivo, live while the children are playing or doing activities, or if it's a direct test. But now with Lena, and I got to talk to you more about Soapbox because I don't know that one, but Lena is such a game changer, because now it's this little tiny chip that you put in like a little pocket. Maybe the baby has like a little pocket that you can put it
like
in.
Like a onesie usually, yeah.
Yeah, onesie, or if it's an older child, maybe they have something that we made our own that we're using. But then you take the chip and you have all that data, and you don't have to do all of the transcription yourself. You just put it in the computer, and oh my gosh, it's an amazing innovation.
Yeah. I want to add one part to that in vivo assessment that you're talking about. So then you leave the classroom and you have a piece of paper that has your scribbles on it. Then you have to sit down and turn that into assessment information. So SLPs spend a lot of time being trained in how to calculate tokens and types and MLUs. And it's a really, really time consuming and arduous process. And so anything we can do to reduce the burden of that assessment, but provide the same quality of information, that's a game changer. So Soapbox, just really quickly about Soapbox Labs. I think it's an Irish company. Their specialty is speech recognition. So Siri, Alexa, right? We know how we can talk to a device and it can understand what we're saying and type our words. They've been developing the technology to do that in a variety of settings, including noisy classrooms. And increasingly, they're getting better about doing it with preschool kids. So preschool children have different articulation. They have different vocabulary sometimes. So it's a little bit harder to do automatic speech recognition with those kids, with that population. But Soapbox is one of many companies that's working really, really hard to bring that technology. So it's fancy machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's way beyond my understanding, but it works. That's what I know, is that it works.
Very cool. Well, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about your ideas on language translations?
Hmm. Yeah, so it's a wonderful thing that we live in a country that probably all of us live in communities where there's a variation, a diversity, a wealth of language communities. So I live in the Twin Cities. In the Twin Cities, we have a lot of Spanish-speaking families. We have Somali-speaking families. We have Ethiopian families. We have Hmong families. We have Karen families. All of those families are doing exactly what we want families to do with their children. They're nurturing them, they're developing them, they're loving them, they're teaching them to talk, they're teaching them to talk about the world around them. What we haven't been able to do for a long time, and increasingly, I hope we're getting better and better at it, is to take advantage of those variations of wealth, right? So we're getting pretty good about doing it if you speak English, but that's not good enough for everybody. And so how do we think about competence development support for kids who speak languages other than English, maybe in addition to English, but nonetheless other than English? And so there's been a lot of attention. There's been a lot of attention for a long time to thinking about those children and how best to serve them. And I think recently we've pushed forward, I think, in really important ways. So behind all of this, I think, and it's important to acknowledge this, is still a little bit of controversy or confusion about what the right thing is. Do we want kids to speak a home language and speak English? Do we want them to speak a home language primarily? Do we want them to speak English primarily? How do we think about what we're going to do to support their development instructionally, programmatically, right? To the extent that home language competence is important, having good and supporting it, back to this idea of assessments being in service of intervention, we would want assessments that are well suited to that purpose, that they give us good information about this language other than English that a child in a family might be speaking. So Lena can do it, right? Lena can do it in Spanish and French and Chinese. There are probably other languages by this point too, but they have adapted their technology to be able to assess those languages. What about the kind of assessments that IGDs are, that the in vivo naturalistic language samples you were talking about, or APS? How do we think about those measures? Well, I think probably, at least from my perspective, sort of the criteria now are a couple of things. One is it starts with respect for that language. It starts with assuming that competence in that language, regardless of, or incidental to the competence in other languages, that competence in that language is of interest and as important. As a result, assessing that language authentically, and I'll come back and explain that in just a second, is critical, because what we want to know is, for this child who speaks Spanish, for instance, how's their Spanish? Is it good? And good would mean, like, can they communicate with their Spanish-speaking family, with their Spanish-speaking neighbors? Do they have competence in Spanish? And then ultimately, can we use that information to better understand where children are and how better to serve them? So I mentioned about authentic assessment. For a long time, and there's still lots of examples of this, we would translate assessments. We would take the assessments that we had. So IGDs has, for instance, there's a task where children are looking at images of pictures, and they're telling us what those pictures are. Well, we could just translate that. What's apple in Spanish? What's cat in Spanish? What's lion in Spanish? And that's how we would assess the kids. That gives us a Spanish language assessment, but not an authentic Spanish language assessment, because kids develop competence in Spanish in a similar but different way than they do in English. So what we need to do in any of these language assessments is start back from sort of core foundational knowledge of language development in that language and respect that process for kids' development. I can give you two examples that I don't know a lot of examples, but I have two that I can give you that might make this a little clearer. In IGDs, one of the things that we do is we try to assess kids' oral language skills. My colleagues, Alicia Wackerly-Holman and Lily Duran and others, have led the development of these Spanish language IGDs that are really cool and authentic measures in the way I'm talking about. One of the things that they noticed early on was that a distinction that helped understand language development for preschool kids who were speaking Spanish was not necessarily their knowledge of nouns, but also their knowledge of expressive verbs. So in Spanish, but not in English, there's a measure, an IGDs measure of expressive verbs, because that's a better, authentic measure of Spanish language development. I've also at Renaissance had a chance to work with some colleagues on development of a very early reading test for kids who speak Spanish. In English, we're really interested in kids being able to sound out letters, to be able to put letters together in combinations, to do kind of phonics skills. So one of the things that our colleagues have argued is that in Spanish reading instruction, there's not a lot of attention to letter sounds in isolation. Instead, there's attention to syllables. Spanish is what's called a transparent orthography. It's much easier to read. It doesn't have irregular words. Things are pretty consistent from time to time to time. So I can learn syllables that are typically vowel consonant or consonant vowel consonant syllables. And that's what I learned first. So instead of focusing on letter sounds in isolation, that measure focuses on syllables that kids might be able to read very, very early in their reading, kindergarten and first grade. So those are two examples of where getting our heads around how to assess a child's home language requires us to back up and not just kind of slam something through the Google Translator, slam our English measure through the Google Translator, but instead come back to what that language is and represent that language's structure in our assessment. One other point, another confusion at this point is how we should think about standards for competence. How do we think about, there's been some really interesting research on this about how do languages develop similarly across countries, right? Italian, Chinese, French, English American. That's hard to do, but if we do it in the United States, we have to think carefully about sort of to what extent we want cultural, regional, and other variations to matter in our interpretation of results. So like, what's the average? Well, maybe the average depends on who you are, where you are, who your family is. There's a lot of confusion about how to think about that. I think that's for your students, Dr. Macy, that's what I want them to help us figure out. How do we think wisely about variations in kids' experiences and development? And how do we think about that in terms of a diverse and multicultural community like the ones we live in?
That's great. Thank you. Those are good topics and issues to explore, and it might be different for each child. And one of the things that we do when we use an assessment is we want to know if it has good validity, reliability, utility, and you've talked a lot about those kinds of topics and how a tool might be useful for different reasons. Do you have any advice for better understanding those kinds of psychometric properties related to assessment?
Yes. So remember I said I'm not an assessment person, but boy, I have had some great teachers. And I want to mention three of them. Michael Rodriguez, who's now the Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota, but is also just a crackerjack psychometrician. Tony Albano, who's a professor at UC Davis, who was a long ago student of Michael's and has been an incredible teacher to me. And Charlie Greenwood, who's not a psychometrician, but who is a brilliant user of assessment, make assessments that people can use guy at the University of Kansas. So the three of them, I think, have really taught me a lot. And one of the things that I think, I can go back to my training as a school psychologist. It was years ago, and one of the things we had to learn about was Anne Anastasi. She was an early 20th century psychometrician, wrote a book on principles of measurement, I think it was called. And she said, tests don't have validity. They have validity for specific purposes. So and now I work with salespeople who say, oh, this test is reliable and valid. And I've been trying to help them understand that it's not valid. It's valid for this, it's valid for that, it's valid for another thing. And so one of the ways that gets thought about sometimes is in terms of the uses that you want to apply the measure to, or the claims that you want the measure to be able to make. So for instance, we might say, I think that this measure, I think that this teacher rating scale should produce similar results, whether it's done by Dr. Macy or Dr. McConnell. And we can test that, right? In a reliability framework, we would call that inter-observer, inter-judger, inter-rater agreement. But in the claims perspective, it's like, well, yeah, we want to know if it matters who does the assessment. We might want to know, I think that this assessment will be consistent from one day to the next, but not consistent across 3 weeks because intervention will have occurred and the child will change. So we can test that. We might call that test retest reliability in the old days, but here it's like being clear about what we want the measure to produce. We might collect a measure of English language development, like IGDs or like LENA, and say, I want to know if this represents the important measures of language development. So we might compare it to the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test or the SELF, one of these standardized, well-accepted measures of language. So I think the answer to your question lies in us being thoughtful about what the uses are for the assessments that we want to administer and how we have confidence that that assessment is going to satisfy the necessary requirements for that particular use. It's not easy, but it's really, really important. And it's important both generally as an assessment developer, we have to think about the sort of the range of use cases that we're trying to build for. But for your students that are going to go out and use assessments, it's really important that they be strong consumers, that they say, is this thing going to do what I need it to do? And if it's not, don't use it. And if it will, but with some adaptation, make sure those adaptations are in place.
Yes, definitely. That's wonderful advice. Thank you, Dr. McConnell. And I think I love that framework that you gave us. And I think a practical tip for using assessments would be to get the manual and to do your homework and be like a detective and investigate and ask yourself, why am I using this one? And who am I using it for? Because you might be using a measure in a way that maybe it wasn't designed to be measured.
Right.
So
Right.
you want to be a savvy consumer, like Dr. McConnell is saying, and really trying to understand. I'm just thinking of an example, like maybe someone, maybe you're going to be using a measure and you think maybe the person might be on the spectrum. And then you go to look at the manual and you're understanding the psychometric properties, what evidence is there to show that it could be helpful and useful for understanding the concerns that you might have if somebody maybe there's concerns about someone that might be on the spectrum, but maybe you looked at the manual and there's no evidence that they were part of the standardization sample. There weren't any studies or research that were done with people with autism or on the spectrum. And so maybe you might be questioning, is this even an appropriate tool for this person that I'm planning on using it for?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a great point. And I think your point about being a savvy consumer is just exactly the right way to think about it.
Thank you. I could talk forever and ever about assessment. It's, I think, one of my favorite topics. But I want to ask you, who or what inspires you?
So many different things. Kids. I hope it's true for you. I hope it's true for everybody watching this, that when we think about what got us to this moment in time, we can identify a handful of children who, some of whom were great successes for us, I hope, and some of whom might have been kind of significant challenges for us. So having that commitment to those people is, to me, really important. I have had, I guess one of the advantages of 40 years of a career is that I've had the great opportunity and advantage to have wonderful colleagues and mentors along the way. They inspire me too. I've mentioned Stan and Hill and Michael and Tony and Charlie. There are lots of others. Diane Bricker, whom we both know and love, somebody who is just totally committed to what she does and does it so well and does it with such energy and such passion. Mary McAvoy, who was a colleague of mine who died 20 plus years ago, but was just a fire plug, could do more things in a day than anybody else I've ever known and do it with great style and humor. And she opened so many doors for me and left them open with her death in a way that has really propelled me forward. My own family, I think that being accountable to the people that know me best so that they can say, why'd you spend your time doing that? They're a really important part of the puzzle too. Yeah. I feel so fortunate to have so many other people to blame myself on. It's not me, it's them that made that happen.
Well, and my last question, Dr. McConnell, is what has been the highlight of your career so far? Do you
Oh
have
my goodness.
one that sticks out, or a few, or things that you just at the end of the day brings a smile to your face and made it all worthwhile?
Oh, that's such a great question. There are lots. So do we have 3 more hours? I can share some of them with you. I can think of two. One is that the colleagues that I've talked about, actually a lot of people that I first met at the University of Pittsburgh, and that have been dear friends and close colleagues. We've worked together a ton for the last 40 years, hardly ever in the same place. Thanks to the federal government for funding us to stay in close collaboration with each other. Phone calls before there was the Zoom thing, Zoom meetings before there was a pandemic, lots of in-person interactions in wonderful places and in really cruddy places. I think I look back on my career, and I think one of the highlights is the people that I've gotten to share it with. The other one that's a little more egocentric, I suppose, is the numbers of kids. So we've talked about IGDs. I haven't mentioned, but I came to Renaissance to help them build a curriculum-based measurement system for elementary school age kids. And I don't know the current counts, but it's something like, I don't know, several 100,000 children have completed an IGD at one point in their lives. Wow. And probably several million children have completed a STAR or CBM in their lives. I sure as heck hope that was a good use of their time. I really do. But the idea that I had something to do with that much stuff going on, it's really humbling and it's really, really cool.
That is very cool. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for your
You're welcome.
work and your career. And you talked about the people in your life, and you've trained so many wonderful graduate students that are superstars in our field also. And if it wasn't for you, these big names wouldn't be here. And I just, the things that
they would.
You've just inspired and done so much for our field.
Oh, thanks, Marissa.
Well, and the other thing is the people and places. And this is just a plug. This year, we're going to be having the conference. Our Division for Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children is going to be in Minnesota this year, and right there in your hometown. And the thing I always ask guests is, how can people follow you? So are you going to be at any conferences, or do you have any ways that people can learn more about your work and continue to follow you?
So I was going to give my home address and they could follow me to the conference in there, but that seems a little inappropriate. Two different ways to follow me.
I know it's a weird question.
No, I think it's a great question. One is, although I don't know when people will be listening to this, you and I are doing this in January of 2023. And right now, Twitter is this kind of weird thing. Like, I can't quite figure out how I feel about Twitter these days, but it is a way to find me. So I'm at SR McConnell on Twitter. And McConnell is McConnell. But I think the other way to do it, you have to rely on Google for this, it would be to Google IGD Lab, IGDILAB, all one word. That will take you to the IGD Lab website at the University of Minnesota, where there's some information about me, some information about Alicia Wackerly-Holman and Lily Duran and Michael Rodriguez and a bunch of the other IGD folks, and our email addresses, so you can find us that way too. And I love hearing from people. So if there's something that I talked about that really irritated you, or really want to know more about it, I hope you'll write me a note and tell me about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. McConnell.
Thank you for this opportunity. It was really fun.